You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wiradjuri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to Radio MMT, Anne. How are you doing today?
Hey, Kevin, and hello to our lovely listener. I'm imagining you as Larry or Larissa, or perhaps you're both or neither.
Or an in-betweener.
Well, today, Kevin, we will be hearing the first part of a two-part interview with economist Lachlan Kerwood-McCall. And Lachlan is a proponent and student of modern monetary theory, the kind of economics that you and I like to use on Radio MMT.
Yep.
And we had such a long and interesting chat with Lachlan, as prompted by his involvement with the ACTU, the peak body for trade unions in Australia. And it was prompted by his involvement with the ACTU submission to the review of the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is Australia's central bank. It ended up being such a long conversation that we'll air it over 2 episodes of Radio MMT. And I wanted to speak with Lachlan because I was very curious to learn what might an MMT-friendly economist who is affiliated with the trade union movement, what might he have to say about the workings of the central bank? And that's because we do live in interesting times when we need to rethink that neoliberal shape of our public institutions, particularly the ones that are running the economy, like the central bank.
Yeah, no, the thing I liked about speaking about Lachlan, Anne, was that we talk about a lot of this stuff and it's kind of all theoretical and to see it applied in the real world with somebody who actually is working in the environment of policy and advice to government and to the ACTU and putting in the submissions, etc., it kind of snaps you out of that hypothetical mode and into reality, and you go, wow, this is actually real. This is affecting...
They are using these ideas.
Yeah, which is a bit exciting. And Lachlan's a very passionate person.
Yeah.
So it's lovely to hear him talk about it.
Yes, it was a great conversation. And I don't know if you know this, Kevin, but gay people do not go straight ahead. They move gaily forward. So let's head gaily forward into our conversation with Lachlan Kerwood-McCall. Today, I am so pleased to welcome to the show Lachlan McCall. Welcome to Radio MMT, Lachlan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I should add, actually, it's technically now Lachlan Kerwood-McCall. I got married about 12 months ago.
So it's Lachlan Kerwood-McCall.
Yes.
Congratulations, by the way.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I understand that you are an economist by training and profession, and I was just wondering if you could tell us something about your journey through an education in economics and even what part modern monetary theory might play in your thinking about the macroeconomy.
I always wanted to study economics from high school onwards, and for a long time there were always sort of various confounding factors that got in the way. I mean, I studied a BA, I'm majoring in politics. I really wanted to do economics, but at the time you had to have a certain level of Year 12's maths in order to do economics. So I didn't get to study it as an undergraduate student. And in hindsight, that was probably a good thing. It meant that I didn't have neoclassical economics deeply ingrained in me when I first came across more heterodox ideas. For a long time, I was always interested in politics. That was really sort of my focus. I finished off my BA in politics and international studies, went on to do a master's in international relations, got involved in the young labour scene for my sins. It was a lot of fun, actually. In about 2016, I was offered a job in the graduate program at the Department of Industry in Canberra. Worked there for about 6.5 years, met my now husband on the way, and basically sort of moved around a couple of departments in that time. So I moved from Department of Industry to Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, worked in the economic division. At that stage, I was kind of like an economist by osmosis, but I was mostly working on qualitative economic policy. There wasn't a huge requirement in various roles that I had for a lot of quantitative modelling. And it was actually as part of the graduate program at the Department of Industry, I did a graduate certificate in economics at the University of Canberra. So I finally got to start actually studying economics formally and getting some formal qualifications.
When you're working for the Department of Prime Minister, is that the PMO that you're working for?
No. So the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, it sits within the Australian Public Service. It's not the PMO, it's not the Prime Minister's office.
Right.
Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, or PM&C, it's a bit of an interesting beast. I suppose it'd be fair to say that for every other federal government department, there's a department and then there has to be a minister or ministers responsible. As in, there's a policy area, there's a portfolio, there's a minister created to tend to the department. But in the case of PM&C, it's a department created to work to the minister, in this case, the Prime Minister. It's definitely non-partisan. A lot of people do think that they assume that that's a party political role. But PM&C's role essentially is it provides a lot of logistical support to the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So pretty much every department in the Australian Public Service has a sort of a mirror, if you will, a corresponding unit within PM&C. And I was working in the economic division at the time.
And who was Prime Minister while you were working there?
Turnbull. I actually got lucky. I got the least bad of the three Tory Prime Ministers. I actually had a really weird knack. It was pure luck. I always had a knack for moving into or out of a department just before a really bad minister or a really bad secretary got appointed.
Parallel to all this, you're studying economics.
Yes. So around mid-2018, I'm involved in the Australian Labor Party. I'm involved in the ACT branch. And I go along to a meeting of the ACT Labor Economic Policy Committee, and someone invited our mutual friend Stephen Hale, now Professor of Economics at Torrens University, at the time a lecturer in economics at Adelaide University. Someone on the committee invited Stephen along to give a talk on modern monetary theory. And of course, it was pretty mind-blowing. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. It turned a lot of my understanding of economics on its head. By this point, I had most of a graduate certificate in economics under my belt. And by this point, I'd been working, I guess, as a kind of pseudo-economist. So I thought I knew enough at that stage about economics. And by economics, of course, at the time I meant orthodox economics. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I come across MMT by meeting Stephen Hale. And the question that I kept coming back to is how has no one else noticed this? If the federal government spends by creating money and it deletes money when it taxes, how is it that the mainstream economics profession has not noticed this? So, of course, one of the first things I did was immediately go to my colleagues, economists in PM&C.
I was going to say, how were they all reacting?
Well, it was interesting. It was, primarily it was a pretty dismissive response. Of course, one of the advantages of living in Canberra is it's quite easy to sort of reach out to academic economists at the Australian National University and University of Canberra. So I'd reach out to various experts and I'd ask, what do you think? They'd normally say one of two things. They'd say, well, this proposal to start printing money, it's a terrible idea because X. And I'd say, well, hang on. I might only be a very junior, at this stage, pseudo-economist. I've only got a grad certificate under my belt, but even I can tell that that's not what the MMT academics are saying. There's no proposal to start printing money. They're saying that, that the federal government already does spend by creating money, and that it always has. They're making a descriptive claim, they're not putting forward a policy proposal. And normally when you correct them, you then get a second response, which was essentially just to sort of obfuscate. And essentially the conversation would sort of go nowhere. They had the same initial reaction that I did, which is sort of a mixture of shock and I think in their case, slight irritation. Like they just didn't want to go there, to be perfectly honest. It opens too big a can of worms.
And I guess that's the thing. It's interesting to see how people in the profession who have subscribed to the orthodoxy react when that orthodoxy is challenged. They're not reacting by debunking it with facts. They're just blocking it and walking away.
Essentially, yeah. Interestingly enough, it's actually some of the young orthodox economists who are most visceral in their hatred of MMT. And it's really interesting. I think it's because there is a sort of sunk cost fallacy here. No one wants to be told that certain fundamental premises that they spent years studying, not just as undergraduate students, but then as master's students, PhD students, they've worked incredibly hard to get into, in inverted commas, top PhD programs in the world. They've gone into work either in academia at top universities or at Treasury, the Reserve Bank, or Department of Finance, whatever it might be. The last thing they want to psychologically countenance is the possibility that what they've been taught and what they've invested several years and decades of their life into, that there are some fundamentally flawed premises. It creates too much cognitive dissonance. And I think it's especially the case for younger orthodox economists, early career lecturers and things like that, because they've of course just come out of an incredibly long and grueling process of studying a PhD. And to find out that actually orthodox macroeconomists don't know, I won't swear, they know stuff all...
Shit is the word you're asking for, I think. They don't know shit.
Yes, to have just come out of, say, several grueling years of PhD and then postdoc and then scrambling to get into a fairly insecure job as a lecturer at a top university, to then be told that orthodox macro doesn't know about the basics of fiscal and monetary operations is of course, a rather horrible thought.
As non-economists, we often say it on the show, but it's good to have that verified by somebody who knows a little bit. So there you were with your peer group essentially saying, no, this modern monetary theory thing isn't worth pursuing, but you did. So tell us about why you think you were motivated in that way and where you went with it.
Let me put it this way. I grew up a closeted queer person and as a person on the autism spectrum with ADHD. Like, not fitting in was kind of something that was very familiar to me. The thought of not fitting into the orthodox dominant paradigm wasn't quite as perhaps terrifying for me as it is for many other economists, because I was like, well, I'm sort of used to it. And I know that there are LGBT mainstream economists who loathe MMT, but I do like the way Stephen Hale describes his MMT journey, where he says, like me, he'd started out in mainstream macro. He'd done his master's at the London School of Economics. He had a job training central bankers, and then he'd started to have his doubts about orthodox macro, and then the global financial crisis happens, and he used the term, that's when he sort of came out as an MMT economist. And I do actually like the analogy, because I think that's actually very much the case. I know some very intelligent academic economists at a couple of mainstream universities around Australia who we've had long and very interesting discussions about MMT, and they understand a lot of post-Keynesian economics. They're familiar with the post-Keynesian literature. They understand endogenous money, for instance. They understand that so-called mainstream orthodox macroeconomics, the models of money in banking and how the financial system works that you find in most macro textbooks are just totally bizarre, totally incorrect, and are not actually used by anyone in the central banking community. And at one stage I sort of asked them, I said, well, so what are your colleagues at blank university? What do they think about your apparent open-mindedness to heterodox idea and to the post-Keynesian literature? And the response they gave, I thought, was quite telling. They said that they don't know. They're not aware of my openness to heterodox economics. Only my closest friends and associates are aware of it. And I thought it does actually sound like being a queer person in the civil service during the 50s and 60s, when...
You have to hide these weird thoughts that you have.
You'd have to keep it to only my closest... It was like listening to a 1950s, Hollywood movie star, to Rock Hudson or someone. Only my closest friends and associates know.
If the truth had come out, that would have been the end of his career.
The Rock was an icon.
He was by far the biggest star in Hollywood.
Not only did women say, that's the man I want to marry, many men said, that's the man I'd like to be.
Well, there are some men who just, they're very devoted to their mothers. You know, the type that likes to collect cooking recipes or exchange bits of gossip.
Ooh, what a vicious thing to say.
I wanted to love her, but I was in love with someone else. I couldn't help that.
He had more than one world. And he had the studio world, he had his gay world.
If the truth had come out, that would have been the end of his career. It's as simple as that.
I'm an inspector.
What would you like to inspect?
You. We've received a complaint about you.
Oh, well, I've never had any complaints before.
Creating a certain level of unemployment deliberately and then allowing politicians and governments to blame the unemployed and shame the unemployed for the fact of their unemployment.
Somehow that little cult helped you discover the truth about me.
Oh, you.
Hiding in closets isn't going to cure you.
Wasn't John Maynard Keynes, apart from being a heterodox economist of some sorts, his sexual orientation was somewhat open-minded as well, I believe.
I guess you would have said he was gay when he was involved in the Bloomsbury group, but he met, I can't remember the name of his wife.
Lydia Lopakova.
Yes, that's it. I think she was a ballerina through the Bloomsbury Circle, which is a sort of very bohemian group of scholars and artists and academics based out of Cambridge University. Very progressive and very open-minded, and apparently up until the point where he met his wife, he was well known and accepted as being gay. But then he met his wife and apparently was genuinely fell in love with her. I guess without knowing what labels he affixed to himself, I guess the best we could say is that John Maynard Keynes was a flaming, fabulous bisexual. It would have been about 10 years ago. It was at the height of the Tea Party movement in the United States. Niall Ferguson, a professor of history at Harvard, a prominent sort of conservative public intellectual and academic, he posited, the reason Keynes didn't care about the large public debt accruing from running fiscal deficits to stimulate the economy is because Keynes was gay and didn't have any kids and therefore didn't have any grandkids to worry about with the national debt, which goes to show even people with doctorates from Oxford and tenure at Harvard can say some incredibly stupid things.
Interesting. Oh, there you go.
There you go.
A cross-section with economics and gender and sex politics.
There you go.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
You know, Lachlan mentioned there this thing called endogenous money, which is one of these ideas floating around in heterodox economics. And as far as I can tell, endogenous means that it originates within a system as opposed to coming from outside a system. And so I think endogenous money is a place where there's one of these fundamental disagreements between the economists that we follow, the heterodox economists, and the orthodox or mainstream economists. And what they seem to be arguing about is what determines the supply of money in the economy.
Does money come from outside or does money come from within? That's pretty fundamental to your understanding of how an economy works to get that understanding correct in the first place. And I've got to say, when I first started doing this, I'm running up against words. I'm just a simple handyman, Anne. and
You're a simple fellow, Kevin, with simple needs and wants.
And a fairly simple mind. And so endogenous and exogenous, these words are being flung at me and I'm sort of going, so endogenous is from within, from within the system, and exogenous is coming in from the outside of the system.
Where does money come from?
So these words are good, but you've got to know what the word means. And so,
yeah, I remember I first came across it very early on in coming across MMT, and I thought, oh no, I'm never going to understand this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I keep a little cheat sheet in my textbook.
Oh, okay.
So when I come across a word that I don't know, I write it down, I give the meaning next to it, and every time I come across that word, it reinforces it, and then eventually I end up understanding what it means. Little tip for anybody out there.
This wouldn't be the textbook that we have on our webpage at 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
It's Macroeconomics by Randall, Ray and Mitchell, and it's written by bloody academics who speak in academic language. But if you persevere and use your cheat sheet, you can actually get through this stuff.
That's Kevin's tip for the day.
So in the next segment we have with Lachlan, he talks about a lot of this monetary versus fiscal battle.
So let's get back to our conversation with Lachlan. The current Australian Labor government recently conducted a review of Australia's central bank, which is the Reserve Bank of Australia, otherwise known as the RBA. And on the 20th of April 2023, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, released the final report from this review. And in response to that report, MMT economist Professor Bill Mitchell, he wrote an entry in his blog titled RBA Review Report Ignores the Real Questions and Proposes to Entrench the Failed Groupthink. And a few weeks later, Bill Mitchell wrote another blog entry titled RBA Loses the Plot. Treasurer should use powers under the Act to suspend the RBA Board's decision-making discretion. And Bill wrote that second piece in response to the RBA adding an 11th interest rate increase at a time when we were seeing inflation falling. Listeners can find Bill's article simply by Googling Bill Mitchell blog. But Lachlan, I was wondering, why do you suppose Bill is so scathing about both the review process of the RBA and the RBA itself?
I mean, where do you start, really? I should say as a disclaimer up front, I was a senior economist at the ACTU, at the Australian Council of Trade Unions, for the last 12 months. I've just recently left to take a break before I go back to uni full-time. So I wrote the bulk of the ACTU submission into the RBA review. I've got the general gist of what the review report has said, and I've read a bit of what Bill has been saying since. But to be frank, I mean, in order to be disappointed by something, I think you actually have to have higher expectations. You have to have unmet expectations of it. I didn't think this review was going to really do very much. I also thought that the orthodox economists were making a characteristic mistake in thinking that the review would be the be-all and end-all, that the review could solve all of our problems. I mean, the fundamental problems in Australian macroeconomic policy are not monetary policy mistakes, although the RBA is inadvertently trying very hard to disavow us of that notion with this latest cycle of interest rate hikes.
Can we just remind our listeners that when we're talking about monetary policy, we're talking about the central bank raising and lowering interest rates.
Yes.
And that sits alongside something called fiscal policy, which is the government or the parliament doing its taxing and spending, and that's how our national economy is managed.
Yes. So the fundamental problem is that we have a system in place called monetary policy dominance, which is essentially one where the goals of keeping inflation low and stable, so preventing major fluctuations in the price level across the board, as well as delivering full employment. There are various definitions of full employment. Of course, progressives define it, full employment, as when everyone who wants a job can get one, and if everyone can get as many hours of work as they want.
That seems like an obvious definition to me.
It does. And that was the original definition of full employment. That was Keynes's definition of full employment. It was used by the Curtin Labor government in the 1945 Full Employment White Paper. It was the definition understood by Franklin Roosevelt and his administration in the United States. But among orthodox economists, full employment is defined as the lowest level of unemployment you can get before inflation begins to accelerate. They use the rather horrible acronym NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U, or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. That's how they define full employment, which I think is just ridiculous. It's also lazy. I think
it's cruel.
It's cruel. It's evil. It's a form of economic gaslighting, creating a certain level of unemployment deliberately, and then allowing politicians and governments to blame the unemployed and shame the unemployed for the fact of their unemployment, which is in fact has been imposed on them as a deliberate design feature of macro policy. But the era of monetary policy dominance, which has really been in place since the late 70s, essentially says that you can control inflation and you can deliver full employment, however you define it, through independent central banks managing interest rates alone. That is to say that there is no real role for fiscal policy. There's no real role for the federal budget in delivering low inflation and full employment, and that essentially fiscal policy just needs to get out of the way of monetary policy. Now, the fundamental problem, I think, that we've got with the Reserve Bank is actually a fundamental problem with orthodox macroeconomics, which is that they are still wedded to the idea of monetary policy dominance. They think that a central bank, regardless of how independent it is, a central bank using interest rates can fine-tune the economy. And unorthodox economists, heterodox economists, whether it's modern monetary theorists or post-Keynesians, institutionalists, other heterodox economists, think that that's nonsense. And I think there's some pretty compelling evidence for that over the last decade, especially from 2016 onwards. Australian interest rates were at record lows. Well, really until interest rates started rising again last year, which I should add, the cycle of rate hikes that began in, I think, April last year is the most aggressive cycle of monetary policy tightening since 1991. This is the most aggressive cycle of monetary policy tightening in my lifetime. In fact, from I think about 2018 onwards, interest rates have been at or mostly below 2%. And in all that time, in the 4 years pre-pandemic, unemployment was way too high, and unemployment has been way too high since 1975, I should add. But certainly I think the second half of the last decade is really when the shit began to hit the fan. And unfortunately, orthodox economists, they did everything but acknowledge the smell, if you know what I mean. Inflation was too low. It was below the target band. The RBA has a band to get inflation between 2 to 3%. We don't want inflation to be too high because that means an unsustainable cost of living. But we also don't want inflation to be too low. The reason being that we generally judge that to be a sign that the economy is too weak, that the economy isn't growing strongly enough.
So it's a case of we want a certain amount of growth. I've kind of described this before on the show as putting like a forward lean on the economy,
yes,
without going too far, without it screaming out of control.
Yes.
We don't want it to be static, which is no growth, and we don't want it to be in negative territory. We just want a slight forward lean on it. That's how I understand it.
Exactly. And of course, there's the argument from the ecological economists that we should be looking beyond economic growth, but just putting that to one side. The idea is that the Reserve Bank, by adjusting interest rates alone, can basically fine-tune the economy and put it in the Goldilocks zone. The Goldilocks zone where inflation's not too hot, not too cold, unemployment is just right. Well, for the 4 years before the pandemic, poor old Phil Lowe, he's been governor of the Reserve Bank since 2016. I don't think he's ever actually been able to get inflation within that 2 to 3%. Now, the orthodox economists say that that's because the RBA kept interest rates too high for too long. And to that I sort of say, what the hell are you smoking? Throughout the entirety of that period, Australian interest rates were at record lows. Record lows. For half of that period from 2018 onwards, interest rates were below 2%. The idea that if you just shaved another few basis points, if it was just 0.5%, that would have worked. And there is some research from Andrew Lee and Zach Gross from Monash University. They put out a paper about a year ago or so using their model, which is a fairly neoliberal, neoclassical model. They show that if the RBA had cut interest rates further prior to the pandemic, an additional 200,000 jobs would have been created. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but certainly that it feeds into the argument. But we're not quite sure if that really would have had much of an effect if they'd cut them further. But let's just concede that argument. But what's pretty clear to us modern monetary theorists is the problem is the government of the day kept cutting the budget deficit. Fiscal policy was squeezing the economy way too tight. One of the main arguments that the ACTU made in our submission to the RBA review is you've kind of got to go back to the fundamentals. And the fundamental problem is actually thinking that the RBA can solve the problem on its own. That's the fundamental problem.
The neoliberal agenda is to keep government out of the economy and let the private sector run it as much as possible. So this whole concept that the RBA, monetary policy, is the only way to control these important economic dynamics like inflation and employment, etc., is basically we're looking at a neoliberal model.
Absolutely.
So for them to have fiscal policy involved in these areas is inviting the government to start controlling things, which is exactly what they don't want. Am I being a bit paranoid here, or does that sound reasonably accurate?
No, that's not paranoid at all. I mean, orthodox economics, whether it's micro or macro, essentially says that markets, if left to their own devices, are broadly self-regulating, except in a few very limited and defined circumstances of market failure. Governments, if they intervene, will make things worse, except in very limited circumstances where the market has failed. It's not a conspiracy. It's what's stated quite explicitly in Econ 101 textbooks.
So the situation with this review is that we are blaming the RBA, particularly poor old Phil Lowe, poor old Phil Lowe gets $1 million or so a year to be the governor.
Comrade Phil.
Rather than blaming the bad economic models that they're using, and the review isn't even addressing that fact.
Absolutely. And I don't think the review was ever going to do that, because that involves challenging too many fundamentals, too many prior assumptions. The only way you were going to get a review that was actually going to properly diagnose both how the Reserve Bank has misused monetary policy, but also get to the real core of the issue, is that interest rate policy alone can't actually deliver what it's supposed to. Like, it's not just that the RBA has used its powers poorly, it's also that the RBA actually doesn't have the ability to stimulate an economy that is being crushed by fiscal austerity, nor does it have the ability to deal with inflation that's driven by, let's say, high global oil prices due to the war in Ukraine. The only way the RBA review could have really delivered some really substantial reform is if you'd had people like Bill Mitchell doing the review. And the government was never going to go with that.
Radio MMT
on 3CR
between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m.
the second and fourth Friday of each month.
Radio MMT.
If you like our show, subscribe to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
And you can find us through your favourite podcaster and give us lots of stars.
And or give us a like on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube.
Your support really helps.
Because if you're not liked on social media, you don't exist.
There are many ways that you can keep up to date with 3CR news, events and programs. The 3CR website is a great spot to catch all your shows via audio on demand or scroll through our range of podcasts. It's also where you can sign up to our monthly newsletter, buy yourself a new t-shirt or check out archival audio from past broadcasts. Of course, we're also on Twitter at 3CR and Instagram at 3CR Melbourne. But don't forget our mighty AM band. Catch us anytime on 855 AM. Keep in touch. 3cr.org.au.
Yeah, so Lachlan was describing how this goal of macroeconomics is to keep inflation low and steady and to keep unemployment low. And I often feel like this is what could be the holy grail of macroeconomics.
Yeah. The Reserve Bank's charter, they have three planks that they're supposed to look after. So there's employment. They call it full employment. We disagree on the definition of full employment, but the first thing is full employment. The second thing is to keep the inflation within the target range of between 2 and 3%. And the third thing is to create a stable economy with macroprudential policy.
That's a mouthful.
and that's something that Lachlan talks about in the next segment of the interview we did with him.
Let's have a listen. So you were mentioning the need to use fiscal policy as well as monetary policy to manage the macroeconomy. And I did notice that the ACTU submission to the RBA review did call for the establishment of a macroeconomic coordination committee, which would deliver coordination across government. So I was just wondering, who and what are you wanting to coordinate here? And can you give us an example of why that would be important?
Sure. So if you look at, say, the pre-pandemic phase, and to an extent during the pandemic as well, we've now got a situation where everyone's saying it was all the RBA's fault. You've now got a lot of economists saying inflation was clearly too low, it was below the RBA target, unemployment was too high, and it's the RBA's fault because keeping interest rates at 2% for all those years was too high. The RBA clearly made mistakes, but the fundamental problems in macroeconomic policy prior to the pandemic really had nothing to do with the RBA at all. The fundamental problems were that the government kept fiscal policy too tight. That is, it kept cutting the deficit, strangling the economy, strangling growth, resulting in high unemployment and too low inflation. And at the same time, APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, kept macroprudential policy too loose.
Ooh, can you tell us what that is?
So macroprudential policy is essentially regulatory policy. It's regulation attached to borrowing and lending, credit creation, credit quality in the banking system, that's essentially designed to help stabilize the financial market and the macroeconomy in general. So, for instance, it's loan-to-value ratios, it's regulatory requirements about the amount of collateral you need to have on hand if you want to borrow.
Mm-hmm. And this is in the purview of APRA?
Yes.
Okay, so now we've got three areas of
So we've now got
policy.
three. And in most central banks around wealthy economies generally control both monetary policy and macroprudential policy. So, for example, the US Federal Reserve, the American equivalent of the RBA, they run both interest rate policy, monetary policy, and they also run macroprudential policy. So regulations around borrowing and credit. In 1998, as a result of the Wallace inquiry into the financial system, in Australia, we split that function away from the RBA. We took a lot of it away from the RBA and gave it to APRA, to a separate body. Now, of the two policy tools, the one that's more effective is actually macroprudential policy rather than monetary policy. In other words, controlling the quality of credit rather than controlling the price of credit, or adjusting the quality of borrowing rather than the price of borrowing. And this is the sort of thing that people like the post-Keynesian American economist Hyman Minsky advocated for strongly in the 1980s during the rise of money manager capitalism. It's long been an argument within modern monetary theorists and post-Keynesians is that macroprudential policy is a far more effective tool than monetary policy. And in Australia, unfortunately, we took that away from the RBA. So we've got sort of a bizarre situation where the three fundamental goals are full employment, jobs for everybody who wants one, low and stable inflation, and a stable financial system. So we don't want major banking failures. We don't want a massive housing bubble. We don't want an explosion in private sector debt. The only entity that really has the power to properly deliver on full employment and price stability is the government, because it controls fiscal policy. But we've given responsibility for full employment and price stability to a central bank that doesn't have the power to actually deliver on those objectives, because monetary policy simply isn't powerful enough. Mm-hmm. And the one tool that the central bank did have that it could actually use really quite effectively and efficiently, which is macroprudential policy, we took that away from them and you know, it's sort of, you know, like a babushka doll of stupidity. We've just passed it on down the line to the smaller and smaller doll until it's landed with APRA. And I think, honestly, as much as the RBA deserves a lot of criticism for how they've managed things, especially since the emergence of inflation, it's almost a cliche now. If all you've got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And that's exactly what the RBA has done. They've jacked up interest rates.
I was thinking hammers as you were talking. It sounds to me like we've given builders a stove and said, go build a house. And then we've given the chefs like a trumpet and said, go make a meal. And then we've given the musicians a hammer and said, go make music. Crazy.
Exactly.
You were talking before about fine-tuning, and I was thinking it's like trying to fine-tune a piano with a lump of wood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My line is, it's like trying to conduct brain surgery with a sharp, pointy rock.
I'm James Juniper. I'm an economist at the University of Newcastle, and you're listening to Radio 3CR.
Now, poor old Philip Lowe, apparently he's been given a pointy rock and told to go do neurosurgery.
Yeah.
In other words, the central bank is told to do stuff that it simply can't do.
It's a bizarre charter, but like we're saying, this whole concept that people making decisions, politicians and policymakers and advisors, etc., don't know the origins of money, where it comes from. And so they have these bizarre methods for trying to control it that don't work. And it's, again, I'll refer back to the previous Treasurer, Peter Costello, talking about this sort of stuff. And he says, well, you need to set yourself up for the next crisis because there will be one.
When the times are good, we should be paying this stuff back. But if we're not doing it now, when we go into the next crisis, and there'll be one in a few years' time. When we go into the next crisis, we'll be going in from a much weaker position.
and you sort of think, well, of course.
How does he know that?
It's kind of like saying, here you go, jump behind the wheel of this car. Now I know you don't know how to drive, and you've got no idea, so of course you're going to crash it a few times. I mean,
we have to prepare for the accident because it will happen.
Because we know you can't drive. So
that's exactly what it's like.
It would be much better if they just learned how to drive, if they understood how a car works.
Yeah, well, I think Phil Lowe probably knows better, but he's just going around banging people on the head anyway with his pointy rock, or which we would call the rising interest rates. And he's doing that because he thinks he needs to raise interest rates in order to bring down inflation.
Yeah, and I sometimes wonder whether Philip Lowe sits there, because if this was your full-time job, all you have to do is sit there and analyse the system, and you've got people around you to advise you, etc. I mean, if you and I can figure out the irrationality of the system, he must know that the system is insane, that it doesn't work.
He needs to come out of his heterodox closet, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, like his job for the whole time he's been Reserve Bank governor since 2016 is to land inflation between 2 to 3%, and he's failed every year. It's either been too low or too high. He's never got it right. So he's had years and years to sit there and try and figure out how to land this beast in the right place. And I do recall before COVID hit, when the interest rates were going down and down and the economy was stalling, and he's lowering interest rates with the expectation that businesses will borrow because money is cheap, and it just wasn't working. So inflation was below target. It's down 1% and diving, and nothing's working.
Yeah.
And he was actually saying fairly bluntly to the government, you need to do something. We need some fiscal policy, otherwise the economy is going to tank. And then guess what happened? COVID happened.
COVID forced the government to have to do the spending that Phil Lowe was in code pleading with the Treasurer to do. And so in a funny way, that's how COVID saved us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's this idea that by raising interest rates at the moment, they're going to bring down inflation. So there's that reverse idea that if inflation is too low, which is what you're talking about, then interest rates must have been too high. So we say poor Phil Lowe because he gets blamed coming and going. But then, of course, Lachlan points out that how could he have gone lower with interest rates because they were already below 1%.
They were at rock bottom, So I reckon Phil Lowe must have some understanding, and I reckon he gladly accepts his $1 million plus salary each year because his job is to bullshit the Australian public about things that he's doing and pretend that they're going to work.
His job is to be the fall guy, isn't it?
Yeah, and he is conservative. He is orthodox. You haven't got a raging Keynesian economist.
You don't think he's a raging, flaming, closeted Keynesian?
No, you're talking about a very ordinary guy here. And I reckon if he did have an understanding, like you and I do, of how the economy works, his job is to shut up, repeat the orthodoxy, take your paycheck, and know that you're going to get sacked by the Labor government and replaced fairly bloody soon.
At some point.
Yep.
He's got to maintain that facade of the mythical independence of the central bank because supposedly if the economic models are saying that at the moment you need to raise interest rates in order to lower inflation, then they reckon that the politicians won't do that because they don't want to hurt the voters. So this is Phil Lowe doing his mythical, I'm the independent central bank.
Yeah. If they wanted to reduce discretionary spending, raising interest rates is not going to do that in any targeted measure. If you're really serious about attacking discretionary spending, which is a dubious presumption to make regarding inflation in the first place, then you would use taxation. You would tax the rich. But then that becomes fiscal policy, not monetary policy.
Yeah, let's get back to our conversation with Lachlan.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
Pre the pandemic, we had the problem that the government was keeping fiscal policy too tight with austerity. They kept cutting the deficit, while APRA kept lending standards, so macroprudential policy, far too loose. And actually, Phil Lowe, he said, look, we know that there's pressure on us to cut interest rates even further to try and get unemployment down. Now, of course, we don't think that would have been terribly effective. But anyway, he said, I acknowledge that there are those who say we should have cut interest rates faster, but we're concerned that cutting interest rates further would lead to an even greater build-up in private sector debt and even more financial system instability. Yeah, this is why I sort of call him poor old Phil Lowe. Is Phil had a
He was in a no-win, wasn't he?
he's done a poor job, but actually it was actually Matthias Cormann, who was finance minister, who crushed the economy with austerity, with the obsession with budget surpluses, and it was APRA who were being sloppy with credit regulation. If APRA had actually done their job and properly regulated borrowing and lending,
right,
the RBA would have been able to cut interest rates further without worrying that would lead to really risky, unsustainable private sector borrowing.
I've been keeping an eye on monetary policy and fiscal policy, but I'd missed this whole thing with macro-prudential policy. So I find this really fascinating. It's like an extra layer that we can all look at.
There's a fascinating report that Nathan Tankus, a brilliant young scholar in the United States, he put out a report in, I think it was January 2022, called The New Monetary Policy, Reimagining Demand Management in the 21st Century. And essentially, it basically informed everything that we said about macroprudential policy in the ACTU's submission to the RBA review. And I think even one footnote, I kind of said the polite academic version of saying, just go and read Nathan Tankus's bloody report. So APRA actually cut lending standards just prior to the pandemic. So everyone who's sort of out there blaming Phil Lowe for slashing interest rates to near zero, allowing people to take on a huge amount of debt during the pandemic. And, well, yeah, of course, Phil Lowe made a mistake in saying that interest rates probably wouldn't rise until 2024 because that's when he thought wages growth would pick up. But APRA gets off the hook to an incredible extent. That slashing interest rates to near zero would not and should not have caused the colossal build-up in unsustainable household debt that it did during the pandemic if APRA had done their job. And APRA didn't actually tighten lending standards until October 2021. So this thing had been racing away red hot for 18 months. And I'd basically dissolve APRA and move all their powers back into the RBA. Now, of course, my former employer, the ACTU, of course, we were much more diplomatic on that point. We did certainly highlight the point that there is, to get to your earlier question, Anne, about why we need a macroeconomic coordination committee, is because clearly you've got an example over the last 6 or so years where the three arms of macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and macroprudential policy have not been working in coordination.
What's an example of loose macroprudential policy?
So there's a loan serviceability buffer. Let's say interest rates are 1% at the moment. The serviceability buffer might be a regulatory requirement that APRA imposes on the housing market that says to a bank, in considering whether or not you will offer a home loan to a prospective buyer, you have to be sure that this prospective homeowner will be able to service their mortgage if interest rates were 4%, let's say. It's essentially requiring banks to do the responsible thing.
So if you were going to loosen that, they'd only have to be able to pay back at a 3% rate, not a 4% rate.
For instance, yes. There has to be a sort of stress test.
But there's other requirements like how much deposit you put down, whether you need a 5% or no percent or a 10% or 20% deposit.
Yeah, those are all examples of macroprudential policy.
Hello, I'm Philip Lowe. I'm adjunct professor at Torrens University, and you're listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev on 3CR Community Radio.
I hadn't expected that Lachlan was going to take us into this amazing realm of regulating the banks, this macro-prudential policy, but it's kind of fun learning on the job here, Kevin.
Yeah, it's something which I haven't considered, but making sure that your economic institutions are regulated to maintain economic stability, it does seem like a fairly basic sort of thing. Again, this is kind of going into more of a government area.
Like an institutional area.
Yeah, but it's been farmed out anyway. Mm-hmm. They farmed it out. They said, that's all a bit difficult. We'll get somebody else to do it. And then they don't do the job properly. APRA hasn't been working properly for years.
Yeah.
The Banking Royal Commission was all due to their lax standards, and they just weren't doing their job.
Mm-hmm.
Just let the markets run free and they'll find their natural balance and everybody will get rich.
So palming this stuff off to APRA was kind of a sneaky way of doing deregulation.
Yeah. What they're doing is they say, rightio, we'll get APRA, we'll get another body to look after this stuff. And then typically, especially conservative governments, then defund those organisations so that they don't stand a chance in hell of being able to operate properly.
Mm-hmm.
And the message is sent, listen, you're a tokenistic body, just do some stuff around the periphery. If anybody gets really out of hand, like if we end up having the head of one of the banks involved in a major cocaine importing deal, you should probably let us know about it. But anything short of that, and remember, like there was all this money laundering going through all the banks, and they just got a slap on the wrist for that.
Yeah.
Hand over fist. That was all APRA's responsibility, and they just squibbed it. They just didn't care.
So anyway, Lachlan has pointed out to us that there are 3 pillars of this policy when it comes to managing the economy, and that's the fiscal policy, which is taxing and spending, monetary policy, which is the price of money or the interest rates, and this macroprudential policy. And I came across a quote that summed up this trifecta really nicely, and it was in a Patreon post by economist Steve Keen. And he wrote, "If we had people in charge of the monetary system who actually understood how money works, then private debt, not government debt, would be kept low. The deficit fiat, which is the government spending, would be kept at a level commensurate with the needs of the private sector for money for commerce and savings, and the finance sector would be kept in check." So that's it, regulating the banks.
Yeah, everybody always talks about making sure all the commercial sector is all fine. How about just people?
Well, that's the code. So they're talking code, these economists. So the private sector is people, households and businesses, households meaning just you and I. And money for commerce and savings, the savings part is, can we give people financial buffers so they're not stressing out?
There's a lot of people stressing out these days.
And I do want to point out too that it's not that we don't want commercial banks or private banks to lend. We actually really need them to lend because they supposedly have their ear to the ground and understand where we need to put money in order to make stuff happen. But the problem is that the neoliberals have convinced us that we need to deregulate the banks. And that means that we've basically just handed over the power to create credit to the private banks without properly monitoring them, which I have heard MMT people say this is like arming a bunch of mercenaries with AK-47s without bothering to ensure whose side they're fighting on.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Because it is a huge power in the economy to create credit. In other words, for the banks to make loans that are denominated in the currency and that look like the currency to you and me.
Yeah. It does make me wonder, what's the point of anything sometimes, and all this conversation? Like we sit here and we just go, everything is just ridiculous. There's no solution in sight. So what's the point of anything? And I guess this comes to the essence of this show, which is, the point is, if enough people understand how the system works, maybe we can pressure these bastards to start operating in some sort of responsible fashion.
Thank you for reminding us of what the point is. Totally.
Yeah, because it can get a little bit overwhelming. And
why do I need to know this? Yeah.
Why do we need to know all this detail? I mean,
well, if your rent's going up and you're having trouble paying for food, this is why you need to know.
There's two options you got in a situation where you have the world going to hell in a handbasket like at the moment. You can change it from within, or you can change it from externally.
Endogenously or exogenously?
Yes, exactly right. You can do it exogenously or endogenously, right?
So Kevin has the exogenous theory of how to change things.
Yeah, so if you're going to change it from the outside, you're talking about revolution. You're talking about an external force coming in and taking over the system. Invariably, it's done by force. And when you have things being changed by force, you end up with all these violent bastards in charge of the system, and the cycle repeats itself. So I guess what we're trying to do on this show is inform people from within, so that they can make informed decisions and that they can change the culture by telling their elected representatives to pull their finger out and understand how the bloody system works. It shouldn't be that bloody difficult.
Well, speaking of elected representatives, Lachlan did mention Matthias Cormann there.
Yeah.
and he was a senator in the Liberal Party in Western Australia for a while, and he is now the Secretary General of the OECD.
I know. I reckon he just got it because of his accent. He kind of sounds universal. He's got this European accent. He speaks very well. So
he wreaked havoc in Australia, and now we've sent him off to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Interestingly, he's had to pull his head in a lot because he was quite outspoken about doing nothing on climate change, etc. And now that he's in this worldwide organisation that takes things like that far more seriously, he's had to do a big 180 on a lot of his previous views. And surprisingly,
I hope he's getting paid enough to do that.
Yeah.
All right, Kevin, you and we are running out of time. Thank you for spending the past hour with us. We will be back with more of Lachlan, and we'll take a closer look at the trade unions and the job guarantee.
He speaks well, Lachlan. It's a joy and a pleasure listening to him. And the next show, we're talking about the job guarantee and other such matters.
See you then, Kevin.
Bye.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get musical.
We're going to do the regression theory of money to music.
That will work. That's good. Regression theory of money. What rhymes with regression? Regression, suppression, instinct. There's a world of opportunity here. This has got legs. This is going to work. Bill on guitar.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.